The story begins with blood stains, footprints all over the floor, a toy boat, and presents on a chair. We are brought 3 months earlier to a prison, where a woman named Emily is preparing to visit her husband. Martin, her husband, was sentenced to 4 years in prison for insider trading or stock market manipulation. Emily tells her boss one day that she will not be coming to work the next day since her spouse is about to be released. Martin's mother and Emily drive to the prison to wait for him. Martin finally leaves, and Emily rushes to hug him. That evening, they make love, but Emily appears sad and uninterested. Martin tells of meeting a hedge fund manager named Marshall in prison. He claims he can help him get work in Dubai once he is released. He vows to restore their lives to their former glory, and Emily responds, "Okay," without excitement. Still looking distracted, Emily returns to the parking lot and places her belongings in her bag. The parking attendant assists her. She buckles her seat belt and begins to drive away. She stomps on the gas and rams her car into a wall. A psychiatrist named Dr. Banks visits Emily in the hospital and asks her about what happened. He asks if she tried to hurt herself on purpose and if she still intends to hurt herself, to which Emily does not respond. Emily refuses to stay in the hospital much longer, claiming she needs to go to work and be with her husband. Dr. Banks is convinced Emily attempted suicide, but she promises him it will not happen again. Emily is released on the condition that she attends his office and begins taking depressive medication. Emily is back at work, she appears unwell and subsequently hurries to the restroom to vomit. Her supervisor comes in and examines her pills, claiming she took it earlier and it made her sick as well. Emily emerges from the restroom, looking ill. Emily visits Dr. Banks one day and tells her how she met her husband. Dr. Banks discovered Emily has a history of depression and previously saw a different psychiatrist. Dr. Banks then consults with her previous psychiatrist, Dr. Victoria. Dr. Victoria describes how Emily became depressed after her house and marriage were taken away from her. Dr. Victoria says Emily tried several drugs but battled with them all, so she recommends Ablexa, a new medication she has already tried on one of her patients. Emily had a miscarriage, she added, and Dr. Banks claims Emily hasn't told him about it. Meanwhile, Emily and Martin are getting ready to go to a party. Martin tells Emily that she doesn't have to go if she doesn't want to, but she insists on giving it a shot. The couple meets Carl and his partner Kayla during the event. Emily walks over to the bar to get a drink. Emily is seen crying after looking at herself in a warped mirror. Kayla walks in and tells her she, too, has suffered from depression and has taken medication. Emily sobs as she runs to the balcony, and they later leave the party. Emily is on the train, staring at an Ablexa poster. Emily then casts a glimpse at a cop, and as he turns around, she walks to the platform to jump as the train comes. Fortunately, the officer stops her at the hospital. Dr. Banks administers anxiety medication to his wife, Deirdre, for her to feel less worried about her upcoming job interview. Emily stops them, telling Dr. Banks that she attempted suicide again on the subway and requesting 5 minutes of Dr. Banks' time at the hotel. She informs him that she can no longer take her present medication. Her co-worker Julia mentioned a new prescription called Ablexa. She wants to test it, so Dr. Banks prescribes it for her and goes to the pharmacy to purchase it. One day, the doctors are having lunch with a medical representative who is advertising an anti-anxiety medication called Delatrex. She encourages the doctors to begin a study of it with their patients, but all but Dr. Banks decline. Emily appears to be in a good mood as she and her husband embark on a date. They are also living a better life than before, and Martin is glad she took the medications. On the other hand, Emily gets up one night, turns on the light, cranks up the music, and starts preparing breakfast. Martin wakes up and requests that she tone down the music because it is still late at night. Emily cannot seem to hear him since she is sleepwalking. They see Dr. Banks, and Martin asks if she can stop taking the medication, but Emily refuses, claiming that she is already sleeping better, having more energy, and feeling better. Dr. Banks suggests several alternative medications, but Emily continues to refuse them, so Dr. Banks simply prescribes more medication to aid with the sleepwalking. One day, Martin dresses up to visit Marshall in prison, claiming that the hedge fund manager intends to open a branch in Houston. Meanwhile, one of Dr. Banks' patients decides to begin the Delatrex drug trial because her prescription would be free because Emily is on her way to work. In a store, she discovers a toy boat on display. She comes at work late and informs her supervisor that she boarded the train but failed to exit. Her supervisor orders her to go home for the time being and asks her not to do it again. Emily returns home and takes an Ablex, which is a pill. Dr. Banks returns home to find his wife depressed. Dr. Banks tries to console her one night after she fails the job interview. When Martin gets home, he sees a toy boat and a gift in the chair. He hears Emily preparing dinner for 3 people and suspects she is sleepwalking again, so he rushes to the kitchen and sees her cutting food. As he asks whether she's sleepwalking again, she stabs him many times until he's lifeless. Emily walks away from him and returns to her bed. The following day, an NYPD investigator confronts Emily, who is crying. She claims she was only asleep when she awoke to find him lifeless. When Dr. Banks arrives at the police station, he is informed that Emily has only been talking about him. Dr. Banks claims they had an appointment last night but Emily did not show up. He is perplexed when asked why the dining table was set for 3 persons. They also displayed the medicines she was taking to him. Banks then informs them of the medication's side effect of sleepwalking. The assistant district attorney informs him that she could be a murderer or a victim of medical malpractice, which could lead to a civil claim by Dr. Banks. Dr. Banks speaks with Dr. Victoria, who informs him that Emily cannot be prosecuted with murder due to her lack of memory and criminal intent. He then meets with a lawyer, who tells him of cases where the suspect was acquitted because he had no recall of the occurrence. Dr. Banks is in a quandary and can't sleep since his job may be jeopardized. Emily is visited by Martin's mother, who is in tears. Emily hands her a letter that Martin's mother read on television. The show summoned the makers of Ablexa, but they declined. One psychiatrist, Dr. Peter, who specializes in antidepressants like Ablexa, explains the mandatory addition of boxed warnings on these medications. The media begins to descend on Dr. Banks' home and harass him. Patients of Dr. Banks are also beginning to worry that they will wind up like Emily. Dr. Banks' medical behavior is being reviewed by the office. The investigator inquires about his excessive schedule and several shifts. He responds that his wife lost her work and that the expenses needed to be paid. Afterwards, Dr. Banks tells Deirdre that everything will be okay in court. Multiple witnesses, such as the parking attendant and the police officer who assisted her in the subway, speak forward. Dr. Banks also testifies about Emily's sleepwalking habit and that she was unconscious, thus she had no intent. The court agrees that Emily will be sent to a mental institution until she is cleared by a psychiatrist. One of Dr. Banks' partners mentions Allison Finn, a patient of Dr. Banks during his residency. She took her own life and signed the letter under Dr. Banks' name. She left the letter claiming that something intimate occurred between her and Dr. Banks, but Dr. Banks denies this and claims it was just one of her dreams. Dr. Banks wants to clear his name, so he searches the internet for information about Ablexa and comes across an article published by Dr. Victoria regarding the sleepwalking side effect of Ablexa. Dr. Banks confronts Dr. Victoria over not informing him about the medication's adverse effects when she recommended it. He then questions her on how she knew Emily had many incidents of sleepwalking. Dr. Victoria is speechless for a time before responding that it was on the news. Dr. Banks then spoke with the parking attendant, who stated that Emily was wearing a seatbelt at the time she ramped the car. He also visits to Emily's employment and inquires about Julia, the person who recommended her the Ablexa. He discovers that there is no Julia working there. Dr. Banks becomes so preoccupied on exposing Emily that he forgets to pick up their son from school. He then tells his wife about Julia, whom Emily made up, and she informs him that Emily is sick, so making things up is typical. Dr. Banks then interviews Emily at the mental facility, and she reports that she is feeling better. When he asks about Julia, she says she worked with her at the bar and hasn't heard from her since the incident. Dr. Banks is perplexed and stunned one night while speaking with the Delatrex Med representative, who informs him that due to the incident with Emily, Dr. Banks must withdraw from the study and they would no longer pay him. Dr. Banks becomes increasingly suspicious after the Med representative informs him about a competitor firm that rose in the stock market as a result of what happened with Ablexa. He tells his wife about what he believes is an insider trading plot in which Ablexa and Martin's death were utilized to boost the stock price of the rival business. His wife advises him to abandon the case and move on. Banks returns to Emily and administers what he claims to be a truth serum. He claims that if she accepts it and confesses the truth to the camera, she would be able to leave the mental facility sooner. Emily appears sleepy from the injection and begins to speak about her miscarried child, Madeline. When he asks if she killed her husband for money, she replies she loved him, and she falls asleep. Dr. Banks shows the district attorney the footage and informs him that Emily is lying. She appeared drowsy and fell asleep despite the fact that he had not given her any drugs. What he shot into her was nothing more than salt water. Dr. Banks claims that Emily is just putting on a show and has been lying the entire time. He tells the DA more about his findings, but the DA instructs him to stop because the verdict has already been rendered. When Dr. Banks visits the mental institution, he notices Dr. Victoria's name on the visitors list and confronts her. Dr. Victoria then sends images of Dr. Banks and Emily to his email account. According to the images, Dr. Banks is having an affair with Emily. When Dr. Banks returns home, her wife smacks him, shows him the images, and then departs. Dr. Banks receives a voicemail from Dr. Victoria later that night, asking whether he received her message mentioning the images and inviting him to meet with her. When they meet, Dr. Banks threatens her again and tells Dr. Victoria that she should already spend the money she received from their scheme because Emily has already told him everything. Dr. Victoria is furious and tells him to get Emily out of the mental hospital and that they will never bother him again at the mental hospital. Dr. Banks instructs the nurse to limit Emily's visitors and stop her from making phone calls. Later, he shows Emily a patient undergoing shock treatment and informs her that Dr. Victoria made a deal with him and wants Emily to have the same treatment. Emily tries to call Dr. Victoria, but Dr. Banks has already blocked her from using the phone. She grows agitated and is sedated by the nurses. Later, Emily notices Dr. Victoria arrive at the mental institution. Dr. Banks approaches her outdoors and informs her that Emily would appear before the judge that week and may reveal the scheme they committed. She asks him again to release Emily, and they shake hands. Emily sees this and begins to scream, believing that Dr. Victoria has sold her out. Emily finally tells Dr. Banks about her scheme with Dr. Victoria. She claims she missed the rich life she had before her husband's detention. She despised him for causing her to lose everything, so she seeks counseling from Dr. Victoria. She had also been abandoned by her husband, and the two of them began an intimate connection. Emily teaches Dr. Victoria about her husband's financial agreements and derivatives, while Dr. Victoria teaches Emily about faking psychological problems. They convinced everyone that she adored her spouse, and she grew depressed as a result. They fabricate Ablexa adverse effects in order to control the stock prices of the drugs created and its competitor, making the two of them extremely wealthy. She then strikes a deal with Drive Banks to be released in exchange for working with him. Dr. Banks requests that Emily be released while Dr. Victoria is present. While Emily is speaking with a patient, she goes to her office. Dr. Victoria asks her patient to go for the time being since she has an emergency. Dr. Victoria tells Emily that she buried the money in two accounts, one in Dubai and one in Grand Cayman. Dr. Victoria continues to admit to the crimes they have perpetrated until she discovers Emily is wired. She opens the door to find police officers waiting for her and is arrested. We then watch Emily travel to Dr. Banks' office, where Dr. Bank prescribes medication for her extreme fury. This enrages Emily, and she storms outside, where the DA, her lawyer, and Martin's mother are waiting. Martin's mother strikes her, and she flees outdoors, where police officers apprehend and imprison her. The film concludes with Dr. Banks picking up his kid from school. They then drive to his wife's house, while Emily remains in the mental institution, staring blankly out the window. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe.